Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a bit of a weird feeling because I'm in Europe for a while, and I started out actually at my alma mater, which is the University of Leiden, and I did an event there, and that event was not in Leiden; it was in The Hague. And now I come back to CEU, which was my first university where I ever worked, but it's not in Budapest. It is in Vienna. So hopefully this is not a trend. Incidentally, there are different reasons. It wasn't Mark Rutte's fault that the University of Leiden is in The Hague. Love to blame him for that, but this had other reasons. So yeah, I moved to CEU in 1998, which was the first period of Orban. A different Orban, but not a completely different Orban, I would say. It's very nice to see a former student of mine here, as well as a future student of mine. So a lot is coming together. I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to argue that we're currently in the fourth wave of the post-war far right, and that this fourth wave is qualitatively and quantitatively different from the previous waves. And that is, to a large extent, a summary of one of my last books, The Far Right Today. Then I'm going to focus specifically on the case of Austria and argue that Austria is an early adapter of this fourth wave, but that it is a little bit different because of its recurring but halted success of the far right. And hopefully that will become a little bit clearer along the way. Having made my career primarily by defining things, I have to always say a little bit about terminology, even though this is not the time and place to go endlessly in it. But the terms left and right are well known, but very differently used in countries as well as generations. And it is still pretty common to think about left and right in socioeconomic terms. Left preferring the state, right preferring the market. There are other interpretations that are still relevant, right being religious, left being secular. Today, politics is 2- or 3-dimensional, and I think we need a bit of a meta understanding of left and right. And that meta understanding was provided by the Italian political philosopher Norberto Bobbio, who by and large talked about the right as all those ideologies that saw inequality in society as natural. And they either see it as positive or they see it as outside of the purview of the state. So they look at society, see inequalities, and think this is how the world should be, or it's not up to the state to make society more egalitarian. In sharp contrast, the left sees these inequalities as artificial, as created, and believes that it is up to the state to make society a more equal place. Now, I'm not interested in all right-wing movements. For me, the far right are all extreme and radical right movements. So which one do I exclude? All right-wing movements that are supportive of liberal democracy, which means a combination of majority rule and minority rights, to keep it very simple. The extreme right is anti-democratic at the core, which means that they do not believe in popular sovereignty and majority rule. They do not believe that the people should elect their own leaders. With regard to the extreme right, you can think about historical fascism. Today, those types of movements are relatively rare and marginal. Yet, in the 21st century, we have seen even extreme right parties in parliaments. Golden Dawn in Greece was probably the best documented one, but even today, a party like our Slovakia in Slovakia is an openly neo-fascist party. Most parties, though, are or pretend to be radical right, which means that they do accept that people elect their own leaders, but they have problems with foundations of the liberal democratic system, mostly pluralism, minority rights, separation of powers. I will speak mostly about the far right as this container for two reasons. First of all, some of the movements and parties that we're talking about are extreme right. Second, perhaps more relevant, a lot of, well, maybe not a lot, but some of the more important radical right parties and politicians have radicalized over the last decade or so and are now kind of on the border of radical and extreme. And I will come back to that. And so some of these are better caught as far right because they're no longer just radical, but they're also not openly extreme. So when we're in the fourth wave, and we can all count, there must be three waves before that. Now, these three waves don't come from me. They come from the late Klaus von Beimer, a political scientist from Germany, who sadly passed away last year. And he wrote an influential article in 1988 where he spoke about three waves of post-war, what he called then right-wing extremism. The model is based on Western Europe, 1988. Remember, the East was still communist then. But I think there are similarities that go a bit broader. First of all, the first wave is what he called post-fascism. It was weak and reactionary, and it lasted roughly from 45 to 55. That wave was dominated by remnants of the old fascist regimes and parties. Most of the members and leaders had been mostly mid-level leaders of the previous period. And the top was killed or took their own life. And in most countries, these parties were banned or completely unsuccessful. And the MSI, the Italian social movement, was really the exception to the rule because they were represented in the Italian parliament since 1948. The second wave, which is a little bit less well-defined, von Beimer called right-wing populism. And it was a bit of an amorphous term already then. It was diverse. It was an opposition to modernization. And it consisted of so-called flash parties. And flash parties is a concept in political science that refers to parties that come out of nowhere, get a very good result, and then one or two elections later, I'm sure that phone can get up. After that, they disappear, leave no trace in many cases. And so the Pujadists in France were one of those parties, came out of nowhere in 1958, 56, 58, and then disappeared also into nowhere. It is the third wave of what I've called the populist radical right that is really the wave that defines our current understanding of the radical right. It's parties like the Front National, now Rassemblement National, it's of course parties like the FPÖ, here Vlaams Belang. And the third wave saw radical right parties get their first electoral results, get into parliaments, not just in one, but in a few countries. But at the same time, that third wave was defined by electoral and political breakthrough. These parties broke into the establishment, the mainstream, but they were considered as outsiders and as challengers to that mainstream, as being completely outside of it. And as a good example of that, in the 1980s and 1990s, there was only one national government formed in Western Europe that included a radical right party, and a very topical one, because it was the first government of the man who died today, Silvio Berlusconi, man crucial to the mainstreaming of the radical right in Europe. So that was the 94-96 government, which included the Lega Nord, at that time called Lega Nord, which was actually a borderline radical right party. Some people argue they were regionalists. That was the only one. Today, A majority of EU member states have had coalitions that include radical right parties at the national or subnational level. And so for me, this third wave ended roughly at the turn of the century and gave way to a fourth wave, which is qualitatively and quantitatively different. So quantitatively is that the far right today gets better results, not as big as many people think. On average, the radical right vote in EU member states is roughly around 20%. So I'm not minimizing it, but that leaves 80% for parties that claim to be liberal democratic, which would argue that we're still in a pretty good shape. We're not, and that has a lot to do with that mainstream. So in the fourth wave, the far right has become increasingly heterogeneous, global, mainstreamed, and normalized. And this has led to shifting and porous borders. And I will go through this. First of all, we have extreme heterogeneity. I will focus specifically in this lecture on parties and kind of like the high level of politics, but of course politics is at other levels too. Even if we limit radical right, far right, primarily to electoral politics, we have a very broad range of forms in which it comes. So on the left up, we have Jair Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil, who is clearly a far-right politician, but got elected on the list of a mainstream party. He tried to set up a radical right party and failed. So you have a president that is far-right, but no party that is far-right. Then we have the Party for Freedom, which comes from my country, the Netherlands, which is actually one of the most stable parties in the Netherlands and has the longest serving MP in the Dutch parliament, Geert Wilders. Geert Wilders is also the only member of that party. Technically, the party has two members, Geert Wilders and a foundation. That foundation has one member, and I'll let you guess who that member is. So we have a president with no far-right party. We have a far-right party with only one member, but about 16 members of parliament. So you have 15 people representing a party that they're not allowed to be a member of, which is mind-blowing. And then on the right, we have the BJP, the Indian People's Party, allegedly the largest party in the world, with an estimated membership of 100 million. All of that falls under radical right electoral politics. Under that, and I won't go into detail, are street politics, radical right street politics. We have Charlottesville, a collection of mostly old far-right groups. Then we have the RSS, which is the street part of the BJP. It has hundreds of thousands of members, is organized all across the country, a huge country, so massive organization. And then we have kind of amorphous groups like Pegida, which attracted at its height about 20,000 people in Dresden over regular periods of time. But they come out of different circles, not traditionally radical right. And at the bottom, we have violence, about which I won't talk, but the threat of radical right violence goes up as well. Importantly, the far right is global. Yes, it is stronger in Europe and more widespread in Europe than it is on other continents, but it's not exclusively European. Again, we have Bolsonaro in Brazil, but we also have José Antonio Cast in Chile. We have Narendra Modi in India. We have Netanyahu and a host of other far-right parties in Israel. The far right has been represented in Israel since the early 1980s and has been in almost every government since then. So the radical right is not a European phenomenon. It's not a white disease. It comes in different forms, but it is predominantly at the moment in Europe. Personally, I expect it to take up significantly in Latin America soon. So for me, the fourth wave, the essence of the fourth wave that makes it so much different from the third wave is not in the actors. The core of the fourth wave radical right is still populist radical right. It's still nativism, authoritarianism, populism. It is the relationship to the political mainstream that has changed. In the third wave, the mainstream was here and the radical right was there. It barely overlapped. And most of the mainstream ostracized the far right, both actors and allegedly ideas. Now, obviously, this wasn't perfect, but it was a pretty strong and broadly shared position. This changed fundamentally in the 21st century, and I think primarily because of 9/11 and the responses to 9/11. Remember, 9/11 itself doesn't do much. It is how we respond to it. The fact that we didn't limit 9/11 to a small group of disgruntled, mostly Saudi elites who had a particular political agenda, mostly to get the West out of the Middle East, but rather made it about a whole religion, Islam. That is what changed the conversation. And most importantly, what it did was shift politics from primarily socioeconomic issues to primarily socio-cultural issues. And it mainstreamed prejudice. And this is partly because of the framing. Islamophobia actually overlaps strongly at the individual level with other prejudices. But in terms of the narrative, is fundamentally different. The narrative about the old narrative of nativism, when I grew up, was about Turks and Moroccans. They were bad because they were different. It was a nationalist argument. They didn't have the right nation culture. The argument, the prime argument of Islamophobia was an alleged defense of Western values or liberal democracy. And it was an argument about security. Both things that are totally acceptable in a non-nationalist narrative. And as a consequence, Islamophobia was much broader carried than the prejudice against Turks and Moroccans. It came from the mainstream right, but it also came from centrists, even some center-left. You could find it in feminist circles. You could find it in LGBTQ circles. Now, 9/11 didn't create these sentiments. These sentiments were there. In the 1990s, you already saw a change to a more disgruntled discourse about multiculturalism. But 9/11 made it possible to say it out loud. The refugee crisis, the so-called refugee crisis of 2015-16, kind of was another catalyst, but did the same thing. What is important is that not only the issues of the far right were mainstream. You can talk about immigration in all kinds of ways, as a challenge or a solution to challenges to healthcare, as an economic opportunity, as a legal issue. But we're talking about immigration as a threat to national identity and security. That is the frame of the radical right, which became the frame of all our debates, particularly after the so-called refugee crisis, actually. And if you adopt the frames of the radical right, inevitably, you're going to adopt the positions. Because if you let them define the problem, then obviously you're going to follow their positions. And if you want to see how that mainstreaming works, you can look at the UMP, which was the mainstream right-wing party in France in the 1980s, early 1990s, and how far they were, at least on paper, from Front National of Jean-Marie Le Pen. And now compare that to Les Républicains today and the Rassemblement National, the successor to the FN. Now you might say, yeah, well, that is because Marine Le Pen is so much more moderate than Jean-Marie Le Pen. She isn't. She stands for pretty much 90% of what Jean-Marie Le Pen stood for. What has changed is Les Républicains. Les Républicains have radicalized on issues like immigration, identity, Islam, to the extent that the current leadership of Les Républicains is almost indistinguishable from the Rassemblement National. A logical consequence, of course, is that when the parties become closer to each other, they're going to collaborate more with each other. And as said, today within the EU, a majority of countries have seen coalitions at the national and subnational level between mostly the mainstream right and the radical right. Let this be clear, the mainstreaming isn't exclusive to the mainstream right. If you look at the Danish Social Democratic Party, they're probably more nativist than the ÖVP. And there are many other social democratic parties that have moved far to the right on immigration. At the moment, the Flemish are doing it and the Swedes are doing it. As a consequence, also, this means that far-right policies no longer are exclusive to far-right parties. To a certain extent, they never were. Remember that in 1992, 1993, which was the first refugee crisis around former Yugoslavia, it was actually the two big parties in Germany that restricted immigration. There was virtually no far right there. Mainstreaming is an empirical process. Just to be clear, the only argument here is that the policies and the positions of the radical right are very similar to those of the mainstream. And that can go through three different processes. The radical right can moderate and become mainstream right, or the mainstream right can radicalize and become radical right, or you can have both. And you meet in the middle. The empirical research that we have very clearly refutes the moderation of the radical right and very clearly shows the radicalization of the mainstream right. Normalization is something else. It is an explicitly normative process. And we see it in a variety of ways. First of all, in the narrative about the people from mainstream parties. Germany is a good example. The Netherlands, always a very good example. Here we see a letter from my prime minister for a very long time, Mark Rutte, since 2010, only Orban longer in power. Just want to get that out there. It says, to all Dutch people. And so he starts out, Netherlands, great country, we'll have values, blah, 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 blah. But we should stick within the norms and everything. Now, he wrote that letter at the height of nativist response to the so-called refugee crisis, where we had refugee centers being attacked by native Dutch people, progressive politicians being intimidated and threatened. And so you think, oh, those must be those Dutch people that should stick within these boundaries. But the next paragraph makes it very clear. And it's pretty much something like, you either assimilate or you go. And so actually, the letter is not a warning for the nativist people. It is for the asylum seekers. And those nativist people, he didn't refer to like that. He referred to as the concerned citizens. And so the concerned citizen is someone who is very worried about immigration and immigrants and is even willing to set fire to a refugee center. Because when we talk about the people in the media and in politics, it very often is actually a subset of people, namely the subset that potentially votes for the far right. The Netherlands is extreme in this case. This is the legacy of Pim Fortuyn, who in 2022 shook up the political system. But other countries is the same. Even in Germany, a country where the far right is much less mainstream than in others, whenever the term concerned citizen comes up, it tends to be this kind of white, older, conservative group. The other thing is that radical right positions have become common sense. And common sense means that they're not political, they're not ideological, they're rational. Everyone knows that. This is common sense. So what is common sense? Common sense is that multiculturalism has failed. Merkel said it, Sarkozy said it, David Cameron said it. If I write a column for a Dutch newspaper now saying that multiculturalism has been a great success, for which I have more than enough data, I will be considered crazy. That is a crazy position. Everyone knows multiculturalism has failed. Immigration, since at least the so-called refugee crisis, is now seen as a problem. Manageable for some, unmanageable for others, but it is a problem. And uncontrolled immigration, whatever that means, is a threat to national identity and national security. That's no longer a party political position. That's common sense. And what do you get then? You get, for example, the European People's Party, the largest group still today in the European Parliament and allegedly center-right group, which puts the topic of immigration under the heading protection of European values. It's a pretty clear message that you send there, right? In the 1980s, 1990s, that message was exclusively in the far right. And another thing is we see open support for radical right parties and positions by elites, not only from columnists, not only from business people or from journalists, but even among academics, and even among academics who work on the far right. Logically, this mainstreaming means that boundaries are shifting. In 1988, that same von Bijmen said, although we cannot define what it means to be right-wing extremists, we know who they are. Now, as someone who defines things for a living, I fundamentally disagree. You don't know who people are if you don't know what they are. But the idea was true. At that point in time, there was an almost complete consensus on who was far right and who wasn't far right. The idea was that these were worlds apart. Today, this is extremely difficult. Who is in and who is out and why? Where does conservatism end and the radical right begin? Fidesz, Likud, Republican Party, Tories. These are some of the most clear examples of parties that used to be seen as conservative, that have discourses that are identical to the radical right. But they're not exactly the same party. Of course, the most confusing is the Conservative Party in Britain. The Conservative Party in Britain has some of the worst nativist politics in Europe. It also has the most ethnically and racially, if you want to use the term, diverse government that we have ever seen, by a mile. Like where most European governments have one or two people with an ethnic background, often working in secondary positions, the whole top of the current government is non-white. But they're talking about excluding pretty much any asylum seeker, sending to Rwanda, having horrible nativist rhetoric about people who come by boat, right? And so on the one hand, They're everything that we don't associate with the far right, namely ethnic racial diversity. And on the other hand, they have exactly the same narrative. This is all very confusing. It isn't so clear anymore who is in and who is out. We have parties that we consider radical right, like the Norwegian Progress Party, which says things about immigration that are more moderate than my party in government, the VVD, which is considered a non-radical right party, but a conservative party. Because the Progress Party set them earlier, and they are the most right-wing party in Norway. But the most right-wing party in Norway could be a reasonably centrist party in the Netherlands, for example, right? And so that is problematic. But there's another boundary, which is much more problematic, I think. And that's the boundary between the radical right and the extreme right. The problem is we have very few real fascists. Now you might think, that's not a problem. Actually, it kind of is, because we have a lot of covert fascists. We have a lot of people who do anti-democratic things in the name of democracy. I live in a country that does that all the time. Voter suppression at all kinds of states. A coup d'etat, which was allegedly to protect democracy. Right? We had one in Brazil as well. And so Orban changed the constitution to finally let the democratic revolution of '89 play out. And so we don't have people anymore that say, I don't believe in democracy. No, we have parties that say we believe in democracy and then undermine democracy. Many of them are neither fully. I think there is a logical reason for this, but it might be a little bit too political sciencey. So the idea is that the radical right came up, needed to stand out. And so it stood out with basic nativism. The mainstream right adopted that nativism, which meant that the radical right needed to move further to the right too, to still stand out from the mainstream right. On top of that, when the mainstream has radicalized, no longer the extreme right looks so extreme. The distance, if you want to speak in political sciencey terms, between the mainstream right and radical right in the 1980s is roughly the same now between the radicalized mainstream and the extreme right. It's just that we all moved further to the right. Austria. Love myself some Austria. Always good for radical right studies. In fact, for my MA research, I spent 2 weeks in das Österreichische Dokumentationsarchiv des österreichischen Widerstandes to study a party that probably no one heard of, the NDP, the National Democratic Party, but the Austrian one, not the German one. So Austria was represented in all three ways. Verband der Unabhängigen was the first, and already there were all kinds of course, remnant groups of the old regime. Then in the second wave, you had VDU and to certain extent NDP. And then the SPÖ can be seen as one of the oldest successful far-right parties in Europe. Now, officially, we date the point that the SPÖ became a radical right party to '86, when Jörg Haider became the leader. But it was at the very least a hybrid up until that point, in the sense that it was a coalition of the nationalist Lager and the liberal one. And I think it's not a stretch to say that at the ground level, at the grassroots level, the nationalist part was always much stronger. But the FPÖ was also a trailblazer. First of all, it was one of the first of the mainstream parties to radicalize. Remember that was it 1983, they went into a government coalition with the SPÖ. They were generally considered at that point in time a mainstream party, and then with the election of Haider as their leader, radicalized and went into a radical right party. They were also one of the first to get into a national government. In that, Austria was the same. And again, I think Austria was actually perceived as the first country where this happened in Western Europe, in part because Lega in '84 wasn't considered fully a radical right party. In part, whenever a German or German speaker says something nationalist, it always resonates more. And so Haider had made remarks about the employment policies of the Third Reich, which I personally think were a bit taken out of context, but it doesn't matter. It went global. And so the FPÖ was, at best, a former Nazi party, but they were seen as incredibly extreme. And for the younger people, that was a time when the radical right was taken into government. You had sanctions. I mean, how insane is that? And this government was sanctioned by, at that time, there were only 15 EU members. The other 14 would not meet with FPÖ ministers. I mean, today, that is inconceivable that you have that type of response. So in many ways, Austria is the ultimate fourth wave country. You have a radical right party that is a radicalized mainstream party. You have a party that has been in several national governments, of course, has been in even more subnational governments, in part because of legal requirements. And you have a radicalization of the ÖVP, the mainstream right-wing party, which was actually crucial to the mainstreaming of the far right. This cannot be understated. Kurz was incredibly important to mainstreaming the radical right at the EU level, particularly within the EPP. Not only did he try to keep Orban in for a very long time, he also tried to move the EPP further to the right. And he was a bridge between the West and the East, which remains important. Like, the EU is still very much West European dominated. Central East European players tend to be secondary in the ranking. And although Austria is a small country, it counts as one of the West. And of course, there are traditional links between ÖVP and CSU, which means that you have the Germans on your side. So Kurz was very important to this broader process of mainstreaming of the far right. But the FPÖ is also a weird electoral and political yo-yo. Now, the electoral ups and downs are not uncommon, although they are extreme in the case of the FPÖ. What is much more interesting, and I think unique, is that the FPÖ went from the margins being ostracized to being mainstreamed, but then back to the margins, to then get back to mainstreaming and then back to the margins again. In most countries, once the radical right has been mainstreamed, they stay there. That doesn't mean that they stay in government, but they remain coalitionsfähig. For the FPÖ, that goes back and forth. The FPÖ has also lost international power. In the 1980s, 1990s, the FPÖ was the second most important radical right party in Europe after the Front National. There were very important personal issues between Jean-Marie Le Pen and Jörg Haider that played a role in FPÖ playing less of a role, but the FPÖ was together with Front National, which today is in the group called Identity and Democracy in Europe. But over the last 10 years, roughly, radical right power has shifted away from that group to the ECR, the European Conservatives and Reformists, the group around law and justice in Poland, and now Brothers of Italy. And with the move away from IND to ECR, FPÖ has become pretty marginal within the international far right. So to a certain extent, the FPÖ is still a bit of a mix of the third and the fourth wave. Sometimes they're part of the mainstream and they're in government. Sometimes they're treated as something totally outside that is challenging the system. And we'll see how that works after the next election, when they might come back. Thank you very much.